begin.
Welcome everyone to our next session. Now today this is a panel discussion, and we're going to be looking at the problem of short-termism on demand forecasting and sourcing, risky business. Now, introduce our panelists here. To my immediate left is James Butcher. James is CEO of Supply Pilot. It's a company that helps major organisations such as Walmart, Waitrose, Co-op, other large brands become more successful and sustainable by transforming the way they work with their suppliers. James and his company, they champion supplier engagement through the Supply Pilot platform, and that enables their customers to transform their supply chains. And our second panelist is Seb Butt, and Seb is General Manager EMEA with supplier intelligence platform Craft. Seb has a particular interest in diversity, equity and inclusion, as well as sustainability. And this saw him appointed as co-chair of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is a global group of 7,000 procurement professionals who seek to make sustainable and circular practices more mainstream. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now we're talking about, agility and being able to predict what's going to happen, and we've just had a series of body punches that just keep on rolling. The latest probably being a mini budget that we were discussing briefly just there. In your experience, I'd start with you, James. How can businesses best cope with uncertainty and particularly unexpected changes in demand?
I think there's two things that recent events have shown us. So I think firstly that uncertainty in demand has certainly highlighted a lot of companies who've had too much focus on efficiency and not enough focus on resilience. So focuses on minimum stock levels just in time was exposed first with COVID, then with global disasters, the war in Ukraine. So I think the first one is the mindset of thinking around that resilience needs to be on equal par with efficiency. And then with no surprise given where Supply Pilot is about a huge advocate of engagement and transparency between principals and their supply chain. So it's about having a rich dialogue with as many suppliers as possible when issues arrive. Seb and I were talking prior to this. It's also been very, very pragmatic in that approach to communications. So I remember when COVID first struck, there's all sorts of panic, but literally, I actually remember it was very early on because at the time we thought it was still limited to China and Italy, I seem to remember. But actually one of our clients, literally just very quickly going out, so I just need to understand which suppliers are impacted with products from Italy, which components are coming from Italy, to just allow an informed discussion, because there's no silver bullet, there's no magic solution to suddenly overcome something like that, but you've got to be having the rich conversation.
Yeah.
I think this, anyway, good to meet everyone. I'm glad to be here today. I think this whole discipline around demand forecasting has definitely been something that has had a bit of a resurgence over the last couple of years. I think all these global events that James just mentioned has definitely made them priorities. I think underpinning some of this demand forecasting, however, I still believe, and I think many of those I've spoken to recently, it's still underpinned on good and high quality supplier relationships, and as James said as well, having those conversations with your suppliers, ensuring that you're engaging in the right way. That's where you're going to get those two-way forms of communication that you need in order to make those rapid adjustments to your demand planning. However, there is kind of great technology solutions now out there as well. Demand planning software and AI behind demand planning has kind of come forward in leaps and bounds. There's a couple of companies that come to mind, Peak and Singwai, doing really, really good stuff. And I think their approach to looking at some of the historical data and using and applying AI to look for forward-looking indicators, to look for predictives of what's going to happen, applies really well. And actually, three different ways. There's the side which is for scaling and growing companies. So if you've got a company that has got demand that was unexpected, it might be doing really well. It might be working or providing a product that they weren't expecting to be as popular as it is. Well, those companies definitely will need to look at the historical trends to see how they can plan for the future. Secondly, there's the ones, demand planning, where external factors or unexpected events are things that you should be considering. So what are those external events? How can you plan for those? Sometimes you can't, right? Something like COVID came along, you can't, and I actually will come back to COVID in a second, but what are the external factors? Are my suppliers based in a part of the world that is constantly getting natural disasters, issues that are going to affect? And so looking at the historical data can again help in those cases as well. And then finally, what about where there's no external data? What can you do for demand planning? And there's scenarios where there's no external data or historical data as well. In those cases, using AI to run decision-making algorithms on a daily basis, maybe even in real time, can help inform some of those demand decisions. So I heard I was at a conference in Procurement. It was in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, and we had the CPO from Domino's on the stage, and he was talking about their demand planning and demand forecasting. And historically, they've been looking at things like commodities that go into making a pizza, things like the flour and the tomatoes and everything. And so there is some external information available, but what they're adopting now is kind of down to actually when someone is on the website for Domino's and they're navigating around looking at the different options available, the software and the algorithms they run can start to predict what you're going to be placing order for before you've even done that. So there's some really sophisticated stuff going on in terms of demand planning that obviously then goes upstream back through to the supply chain and what you want to be ordering.
And I'd be curious to know, if you were going to give procurement as a global industry marks out of 10 for how well they've managed to roll with these supply chain problems over the past few years, what kind of mark would you give them?
Interesting one. I think even when we felt the worst of the pain of availability in store, I actually think that globally people reacted pretty well. If you look at the results. In terms of what was going on behind the scenes, it was also blind panic, I think, in many places. And I think just the example Seb was talking about there was kind of, it's that sophistication of where Domino's is going is amazing, but almost misses the point that says when there is an issue, they've not got a second source for tomatoes or something like that. Kind of, it's the I think, was it Plato, in terms of necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, there was all sorts of creativity that came out. And I think that was looking at where I can get things in different places. How can I shorten supply chains? How can I take certain ingredients out of products to make it more available, more accessible? But I think it shone a light on how transactional a lot of the relationships were. So, many people had to second or third source materials. And actually, those relationships didn't exist or had been sufficiently transactional in the past that suppliers go, I don't want to work with you. I'll stick to my trusted relationship. So I'm going to make no apologies for that. I always bang on about this engagement, but having that rich way of communicating, make it easy for people to start working, understand what you need of them, etc. I think there's so much more opportunity to do that. And I think that starts with the procurement process of being very open-minded. So we see a lot of someone going out saying, I need this item, I need this product, rather than going, actually, I need something a bit like this. What can you do for me? That's just as relevant in responding to the pandemic as it is on something like sustainability. I think there's, again, procurement teams, there's lots of tools that allow a very formulaic tendering process of, can you make me one of these, right? Rather than actually saying, I'm looking for a vessel for water about this size. What could you do that might be more sustainable, might be more, could be reusable, could recycle, and change those boundaries. So I think there's hopefully, the last few years has made people realise that we need to be a bit more open in that conversation, a bit open-minded to the process, which hopefully then helps drive things like sustainability, but also helps creative ideas that brings that resilience we need.
Okay. I think building anything under duress and in a firefighting situation is going to have its challenges. And to answer your initial question, I think the procurement industry responded as well as they could have with all the things that were going on and continue to happen, right? In fact, I've only been kind of working with the procurement industry for about 6 years. And the collaborative nature of it surprises me sometimes how this whole idea of cross-fertilization of ideas across companies, across teams, some of those competitive forces that don't enable other parts of a company to share ideas doesn't really play as much a factor in procurement. But building, as I said, anything under a scenario where things are going wrong, that strategy is going to be difficult. And I think, taking a very specific example, a lot of companies deployed technologies of all sorts of varieties, whether it's to manage demand forecasting, whether it's to manage supply risk, whether it's contracting or whatever else it may be. And what's perhaps been missing there is the glue that brings all those together, and the limited value creation is something I hear a lot from those working in procurement, that maybe taking one step back now that we're away from some of these really desperate situations, we can start to look about how do we combine all of these so that they work together, and so that the adoption rates for some of these technologies or data that you're buying or whatever else it may be, the adoption remains high, so people start to use it, people start to incorporate that into their workflows. Otherwise, wasted energy, wasted effort, and how many times can you attempt to deploy a software application in your company, and if it's going to fail, because then the next one that comes along, you're going to have 30% more skeptical people who probably will not start to use it. So I think building anything in that scenario is difficult, but the industry response is what is it good to?
So it's a kind of works hard and has shown signs of improvement. If it's a report card, maybe.
But,
a
little bit of cheating, probably.
But it's not chess. But,
and just one more point on that, actually, if I may. I think all of what I've just said as well, I think we've touched on it already, but the supplier relationship management side, maybe that we can define that as cheating, maybe we can define that as using trade secrets or who you know, but I think that all of that is actually supplier relationship management. So using, for example, technology to take away some of the more laborious tasks that people in procurement are expected to do, opening up and unlocking time that can be spent developing those relationships, I think is key.
But I think building on what you said earlier as well, when these new systems and processes are being launched, you have to invest that time and effort to get people to want to use them, to understand them, to get that return on investment. I think one of the earlier panels, someone referred to the foie gras approach of just ramming it down their throats.
Yes.
It doesn't work. You get 20, 30% adoption. I think the McKinsey statistic is something like 70% of initiatives fail due to lack of stakeholder engagement. So they fail to reach their full potential. They fail to get that adoption. So I think that engagement around what that's being done is having the candid conversation. Before the panel started, Seb and I were also talking about the impact of that engagement and going down into the supply chain and understanding the supply chain. So again, go back to when we had shortages on the shelves and there was no flour. Apparently, home baking was taken off, but there was no flour. There was plenty of flour, but the bags were made in China and we couldn't get the bags. And you kind of so hopefully it's made people reconsider actually not just how resilient it is, but also how sustainable it is to be having bags made the other side of the world, etc. But actually understanding where these things are in the supply chain so that you can react more dynamically and you can have the conversation. I think is another important part of using these tools to understand that supply chain.
Absolutely, the whole visibility piece. I mean, it's probably one of the biggest challenges that organisations are working on right now. You know who you pay your bills to, right? But who are they paying their bills to, and who are they buying their things from? And so if you don't have the visibility there, then it's difficult to predict as far ahead as you possibly want to start to be able to predict of problems that are going to be coming down the pipe. So if you find out about a delay from your tier one supplier, that's probably at the point where you're about to start using that component or that product or that flour to make something. But if you can find out 3 weeks, 3 months ahead of time, you can have a plan B and a plan C in place. So I think getting visibility into the tiers is becoming critical. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's an important one to look at.
Seb, you mentioned earlier on collaboration and how important that is, for businesses to remain responsive to shifts in demand. Be interested to know from you and from yourself as well, James. But what sort of, do you have any case studies where you've come across companies or clients we thought that's a fantastic example of a collaborative approach that has solved multiple problems across multiple organisations?
So go back to the subject of demand planning. There are many companies who will basically share via dashboards service levels of what stock is coming in, that kind of thing, which is great. It's transparency is one of we consider the 3 pillars of good engagement. But certainly one of our clients took the unusual step of also sharing their internal performance between their own depots and their own stores, which you keep that sort of information guarded. They shared that openly with their suppliers, saying, actually, there's another input, because that retailer in that example is trying to manage thousands of lines across hundreds of suppliers. And probably the best person to do that demand planning is actually that supplier. They knows what they've supplied for however long. But by letting them that next side inside the door to actually see what's actually going on, they can go, actually, it stops them getting wrong indicators of what's going on just at the service level. So it's just a very simple example of transparency in action. And I know for a fact that was an interesting challenge for them, because there were people going, we don't want to show our suppliers that. We don't want to show our inefficiencies. They said, well, but let the suppliers help you solve those inefficiencies. Be transparent. Ultimately, it improved demand planning throughout the supply chain. It allows suppliers to take very practical steps of going, I'm not going to make all this product and put it on the shelf. I think I need to order some more of those labels to be ready, or whatever it might be. Just being transparent.
That must require a different kind of mindset, I imagine, for companies to share that kind of data that previously would have been thought of as sensitive. Do you see that as being a barrier to collaboration in any way?
It's a really interesting point, actually, and I will answer that in one moment. I want to just bring us back to maybe an example I've got in mind as well, a very specific one around kind of collaboration and kind of pooling resources together to get the answers that you need. It's connected back to the point that we were talking about a moment ago around supply visibility. And so we work with a very large pharmaceutical company who recognized that understanding the multi-tier supply chain is going to be critical for them to be able to plan and have forecasting in place and be more and more resilient as much as they needed to be. But we also recognize the limitations of how you can capture some information. So the problem is to know who's your tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 4 supplier, the suppliers of your suppliers, etc. And that information can be surveyed, but it's a very, very difficult process, and it's going to take a long, long time, and you'll probably need a platform like James's to be able to do it well. So there's that one process of doing it, which will take some time and effort. The other way of doing it would be to look and scrape together information available from customs data, from websites, and kind of bring that information together to build out as much as possible a map of what that multi-tier looks like. You're going to get higher success results when you're looking at manufacturing companies, when there's movement of goods, lower success rates when you're looking at things like financial services. And so we collaborated very closely with this customer, and how we benefited in that relationship was what we brought to the table, what we could bring. They brought to the table their trade secrets years and years of understanding how suppliers work and who they work with and where they procure things from and who, if they have any visibility to what's in the tiers. So you combine those two data sets together, what we have publicly available, what they brought together from their years of working in the space, and that's what's giving you an optimal result as much as possible to start to understand those supply chains. So yeah, absolutely. I think collaboration is key. I think working with innovative companies that are tackling old problems in newer ways is something that definitely would recommend.
I think to your question in terms of change of mindset, a word we use a lot is being pragmatic. So when you want to go and ask for this additional information, there's a real tendency to overgrab and ask for far too much information. So if you're looking at sustainable sourcing of cotton, for example, it would be ideal to know exactly which farm, which growers, where all of this information comes from. That's quite an ask logistically to collect all that information, but it's also information that people want to keep close to their chest. They're worried about being cut out of the supply chain, or they're worried about undermining relationships. But in the first instance, all you might want to know is I just need to know what region it's coming from. Right? So if I can be pragmatic and start with something simple, with which region it comes from, I know which regions are more problematic than others. It means that I've got that information. So if we think back to obviously the shock with Ukraine this year, I can immediately go, oh, I can see my exposure. I now need to have a slightly richer conversation with those. So being pragmatic at that first ask, it builds trust, it builds a dialogue, and allows you to go and get that next level as it comes. So I think it's a lot of pragmatism, and I think as you can tell from the grey hairs, obviously not a young chap. I can also say I think fortunately there's a bit of a cultural thing. I think there's a younger generation who are happier to share. I don't know whether that's grow up with social media, etc. But I think there's more understanding of an openness and collaboration. That's hopefully coming through with a new generation of managers and leaders.
There's so much changing, isn't there, really, in supply chain procurement? Yeah. It's almost changing before your eyes, isn't it? Everything's moving so quickly.
I mean, I barely know what a blockchain is, but I've heard a lot about it. And one of the things I'm hearing from some of the newer startups or folks trying to tackle this is that in the future, information from supply chains is going to get shared possibly across blockchain. We're using blockchain as a way of doing it in a way which is not going to be tamperable. So that's probably something that we've got to look forward to in a few years from now. Yeah. But again, it kind of built on that sentiment that you shared, that appetite for getting the job done, and whether that means maybe lowering some of those competitive barriers, that might be the way forward.
And on that note, actually, Seb, talking about appetites for getting things done, being faced with these series of seemingly never-ending problems. Well, both of your companies are part of the rich, sort of ever-growing supply chain sort of tech ecosystem, aren't you? To what degree would you say that disruption and difficulties have driven innovation within your own businesses and within that ecosystem generally?
I think demand for it has massively increased. I think ahead of the last few years, there were organisations like ours and many others building on some of those more typical risks that people were used to that were going to be happening on an annual basis, perhaps changes in weather, but then you throw into the mix things like the pandemic, things like the invasion of Ukraine, and these were unexpected black swan events, and I think organizations are now starting to prepare and need to prepare for those kinds of events as well as anything else, and so the appetite has increased by the buy side, those working in procurement and supply chain, and then the industry's reacted. I mean, if I think of last year, there was 210 approximately startups that were funded around 35 billion VC funding in the procurement and supply chain ecosystem. And that was last year. I expect that number is probably going to be similar or higher this year. And so that tells you exactly how much of an appetite there is and how the industry is responding to it as well.
I mean, I think as an industry, we've benefited for that, and it's driven innovation. But I also think there's a danger that it becomes a technology grab. So this point of pragmatism that I referred to, I think blockchain's a great example. I've spent a lot of my career in the food industry, and if we remember Horsegate, and there's actually if we'd had blockchain, it would have stopped that. We wouldn't. Actually, we knew exactly where all the stuff came from. All the traceability was there. Systems were in place. The reality is somebody lied. It was food fraud, and they, at the very start, they labelled horse as beef. They could have put that in blockchain. It still would have been horse as beef. And I think so this might seem strange from a technology company, but I think we've got to be careful that we don't over-apply technology. We've still got to have those relationships. We've got to be pragmatic. Again, another example that Seb and I were chatting around was Scope 3 in the sustainability front of, lots of people are wanting to understand their Scope 3 emissions. That involves them reaching out to the supply chain, but there's so many people trying to use different frameworks and different approaches, trying to collect information from companies who can't yet spell carbon, so there's no way they can fill in this detailed information,
Sure.
rather than actually meeting suppliers where they are on that journey. So yes, it's driven innovation, but I'd also caution all of us about ultimately trying to get technology to solve people problems.
Now, we're approaching the end of the session here. Thank you very much, gents. We've got time to take a few questions from the floor, if anybody has a question for either of our panellists here. No,
You did a good job, Seb. Comprehensive.
You've answered everything. There's nothing left to ask. But let me just see if we've got anything online for you, gents. So let me see here. We've got one question here. If a business came to you and said, we can only afford to do one thing to make our supply chain more efficient, what would you advise them? Do you want to take that one first, Seb? Or?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier, I think, and it adds to the point that James made around pragmatism. I think it's managing those supplier relationships as well as possible. I think it's becoming a bigger and more difficult task. I think there's some really good, interesting technology applications out there now that can help to reinforce those relationships. The whole idea that you manage your suppliers in the same way that a sales team would have managed previously their prospects and their leads and opportunities, kind of having that depth and level of information around your suppliers is going to be fruitful in the long term, because ultimately when things do go wrong, you're going to end up relying on picking up the phone and speaking to someone that you know well and that you have a relationship with to try and get you out of a potential hole.
James?
I won't surprise anyone. I believe it's all around that engagement, but I think it's engagement about resilient and shorter supply chains. So I've blurred a few answers there, but I think this resilience needs to be on equal footing with efficiency. If there's, the last 2 years has taught us anything around that. And as part of that, and with our sustainability hats on, actually looking at shorter supply chains, I shouldn't be unable to supply flour because I'm dependent on bags from the other side of the world, for example.
Yeah. And I guess there are thousands of examples like that as well, aren't there?
And on that point, with regards to kind of shortening the size of the supply chain, I think that's a really, really critical point. I think previously where cost has been the main driver to figure out where you want to get your goods from and what combination or configuration, I think that has to almost take a slight second, kind of be demotivated in terms of a priority. And you should think of, actually, if I can source something from Europe, is that going to make life easier when there is a problem, or at least have a plan B in place that you can defer to if that becomes an issue? So
I think we've got time for one final question. If you could be brief, gentlemen, I'd appreciate it. Now, it used to be that previously, maybe pre-pandemic, that businesses would look at the past in order to be able to predict the future. Would you say that is no longer possible, or is it just less possible?
I'm happy to start. I think it's still possible. I think you should still, stable stakes. There's going to be natural fluctuations, natural things that happen every year that we can still use demand forecasting for. We can still use fantastic AI technology to predict those. But at the same time, to the point that I made earlier, you also need to start preparing for those black swan events, which we've seen a slight uptick in those over the last couple of years. So it's important to prepare for both, really.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I certainly did a great presentation a couple of weeks ago that one of the big things was a lot of what's gone on the last 18 months, just look at a noise. So don't try and use the last 18 months to do any of that prediction. But no, we always have to look back, and we can always be richer from learning from history, but we need to not falling into the trap that ignores these events are only just around the corner.
James, Seb, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thank you.